Mad Men was sold to me as the spiritual successor to The Sopranos, which happens to be my favourite TV show of all time. Matthew Weiner, who was also a writer on The Sopranos and was supposedly David Chase's key protege, is the series creator behind Mad Men, David Chase obviously being the series creator of The Sopranos. So going into my recent blind viewing of the first episode of Mad Men, my expectations were quite high, but Mad Men entirely surprised me with how outstanding its first episode was. It was so great, in fact, that the feeling I got from the final few twists in the episode of fueling the creation of this video that I had no intention of making up until a few days ago. I've now seen this episode 3 or 4 times in full, and it's still getting to me. I'm still picking up on new narrative and thematic idiosyncratic details that make this show even better. This show has given me so much to think about, and I've only seen a single episode. I haven't even seen episode 2 yet, and this has led me to quite a bit of introspection about the media I consume. Now, if this is the first video of mine that you're watching, I apologize, but for a second, we need to talk about anime and I need to address my central viewership. Usually on the channel, I cover anime and manga, and the more I diverge from these mediums, the more I ask myself why I even bother. Basically, Mad Men has made me ask the question, why do I waste my time with anime when everything else is so much better? This episode did so much in terms of characterization, theming, character development, and social commentary, and you nearly never get any of this with anime and manga. Evangelion, Cowboy Bebop, and Black Lagoon are all great, so is Berserk and Attack on Titan, but it takes them all forever to make a point. And Mad Men makes so many different points in a single 40 minutes, and I was so refreshed. Mad Men addresses systematic sexism in the workplace, sexual harassment in the workplace, racism, gay issues, the morality of being faithful to your wife, the morality of deceiving people through advertisements, smoking, and so much more in a single episode. Anime just doesn't do this, and it doesn't offer what I'm looking for nearly ever. I've been very blatant that my favorite thing in any medium is dialogue. Great dialogue is the number one thing I look for, and it's no secret that anime has terrible, expository, unnatural dialogue most of the time. So then why have I watched and read more anime and manga than Western television that has this great dialogue I actually prefer? My actions seem to be in contradiction to my words, and I think I've boiled down the reason I watch anime more than Western TV, and why I think the trend, especially amongst young people over the 2010s, has been to watch more anime over Western TV, to 3 basic reasons. Number 1, anime is very easy to pirate, and therefore all anime is accessible to any teenager at any time for free. Number 2, there is a strong online community about anime, and number 3, anime episodes are only 20 minutes long and don't take up much of your time. Implicate all this with the fact that anime is usually really dumb and easy to understand, and it's easy to see why it has taken over the West, and I fell into it. But again, now understanding how I got myself into this position, why do I stay in this position? It's something I'm going to have to consider moving forward, so to all my regulars, we'll have to have a talk about this and see where we go moving forward. This single episode was so good it made me think about all this. So I'd like to influence my audience to come on this journey as well, and to do that we actually have to talk about Mad Men. Mad Men is a historical drama set in the 1960s about advertising. We follow Don Draper and his co-workers, namely Peggy Olson and Pete Campbell, as they tackle professional and personal issues. This pilot was primarily about Draper figuring out a way to advertise cigarettes as the public starts to realize that they are harmful. This as a premise is incredibly interesting to me, and as mentioned above, one of the core thematic elements of this episode, and probably the series moving forward, is systemic sexism in society, and more specifically in the workplace. That's the general overview of the series for someone that's never heard about it or seen the series. This episode's 2 strongest elements, and the reason I liked it so much, was thematic elements, mostly with sexism, and the way it characterizes its characters misleadingly, which plays off at the end of the episode with a few masterful twists. So I'm going to go through the episode chronologically and demonstrate how this show does both these things so effectively. We open the series in the episode with an introductory scene for our protagonist, Don Draper. Social commentary is clearly a core aspect of this show. Mad Men has something to say, especially when it comes to structural and systemic inequality, as we have already gone over, and systematic racism and sexism come to play in this opening scene immediately. In the 1960s, racism was thriving, and this is demonstrated in the episode by the representation of black people. There are 2 black characters in this episode, a lift operator in an upcoming scene, and the waiter here in this scene. Draper is at a bar thinking about his coming meeting with Lucky Strike, the cigarette company, as he tries to develop a strategy to sell cigarettes in a changing society. He questions his waiter, who happens to be a black man, about this. Before they can even begin their conversation though, another waiter, a white waiter, interrupts and demeans the black waiter, saying that he can be a little chatty. This is ironically before he's even said a word. The important part thematically happens next when Draper stands up to the white waiter for the black waiter, whose name we learn is Sam. This is Draper standing up for the oppressed against the oppressor, and this isn't the last time this will happen in this episode. This endears Draper to the audience as they perceive him to be the good guy, standing against this evil institution of racism. This is part of the characterization I like so much, and it's important that the audience likes Draper initially so the twist works later in the episode. Throughout the episode, it is made apparent that the three core characters all function within the system of oppression. In this opening scene, racism is the issue, but the episode focuses more on systemic sexism, and that's where it comes clear where our three core characters fit into this hierarchy of oppression. Draper functions as the audience surrogate, championing Draper functions as the audience surrogate, championing their feelings. He is nice to Peggy and belittles Pete for his sexism. He stands up for the oppressed. Pete, on the other hand, is the representation of the oppressors as he indulges in sexist behavior and workplace harassment throughout the episode. And Peggy, of course, represents the oppressed in the episode, as we see the hardships of 1960s oppression through the eyes of an innocent, sympathetic woman. This is how we are introduced to these characters, and these are the initial assumptions made about their roles in the narrative. But these are not necessarily true depictions of who each character is come the end of the episode. And the way the narrative drip feeds you information to make you believe that everything I just outlined about these characters, by leaving out key details of their lives, is some of that brilliance I've been going on about. I'll be sure to point this out as we progress. But if we can return to the opening scene, it actually has more to say thematically. Mad Men is very good at representing all stages of systematic oppression. There is very much a system working against women in this setting, and this is shown in every status of society. And the way it's portrayed here again is very brutal and real. The fact that in this opening scene, an oppressed minority in Sam, the black waiter, still makes fun of women and calls them gullible for believing everything they read in magazines, shows that even fellow depressed minorities aren't above oppressing others. I'm sure Sam doesn't hate women, but he is leaning on the societal persecution of women here, basically calling them all stupid, when he'd certainly get angry if someone made fun of black people as an oppressed class here in the 1960s. Everyone plays into the systematic sexism here, that's what makes it systematic. And Mad Men does a great job throughout the episode, especially with other female characters and their internalized oppressive behaviors in demonstrating this. The ultimate irony here is that Sam laughs at his wife for warning him that cigarettes are dangerous, saying that she's gullible for believing everything she reads in magazines, when the audience in fact knows that she's right and cigarettes are harmful. The point is, even other oppressed minorities enact casual sexism here, and that's important in properly portraying systematic oppression. The next scene stays with Draper as we continue to characterize him as he visits his artist girlfriend. It is made evident nearly immediately by her costume and the way she talks to Draper that these two are seeing each other. But the important piece of characterization for Draper here is that he actually didn't come over specifically to sleep with her. He actually did want to run some ideas by her first. She is the one that initiates sex with him, not the other way around. This is important because, again, it makes you think that Draper is not a womanizer. He's not just using this woman for sex. He clearly enjoys being around her, which endears him to the audience. This scene endears Draper to the audience in other ways too, like the fact that he doesn't take himself too seriously. He laughs as she makes fun of him, and it shows the audience that Draper knows how to laugh at himself. This scene continues as we cut to the next morning, and Draper sarcastically floats the idea of them getting married, and she laughs it off by asking if he thinks she'd make a good ex-wife. Again, everything here is servicing the characterization of Draper. Everything done here is to get you invested in this relationship because it's fun to watch these two characters interact, and they seem like a good, happy couple. We are rooting for them to succeed, especially with the limited information we have now. Therefore, we are rooting for Draper. It is imperative for the twist later in the episode that we like Draper, and this factors into that effectively. We then transition immediately into the introduction of Peggy, and again, the characterization here is sudden and quaint. Peggy is immediately portrayed as the innocent girl who's in over her head in this clearly male-dominated environment. This is her first day, and she becomes one of Draper's secretaries, so the whole fish-out-of-water situation is also being played up here. Her costuming reflects all of this, and so does her general demeanor, and this immediately endears her to the audience. She's innocent and better than this world, and seeing her slowly being confronted with the uglier aspects of life makes her sympathetic to the audience, especially a male demographic that likely will have some sort of protection complex about her. The theme of systematic oppression is immediately brought up here, and Peggy is made immediately sympathetic as she is harassed here by 3 dudes that work in the office. I don't remember their names, but I'm sure they'll be around more as the series continues. They very blatantly make sexually suggestive comments passive-aggressively, acting like she's not there, talking about how they're enjoying the view and that they don't like nice girls. One of them will even comment later that they only did this to indirectly tell her how to act around them. If they don't like nice girls, then to placate them, Peggy can't be a nice girl. And this is another important undertone about this episode. Continuously, it is demonstrated to Peggy that she is supposed to act a certain way to appease men to succeed. Peggy is obviously very impressionable at this point, and we will see how these constant implications will affect her as the episode continues. Just like with Draper, the characterization of Peggy as the innocent girl we are supposed to be sympathetic for is something that the audience must understand for the twist later in the episode to work, and this scene does a great job at achieving that. Then we are introduced to the last of our 3 core characters and our possible antagonist, Pete Campbell, who's lying to his fiancée on the phone, who's scared of what he's going to be up to at his bachelorette party with the boys this evening. The characterization of Pete in this episode is basically the exact opposite of the characterization of Draper. He is the oppressor and the womanizer. Pete is lying to his fiancée, and it is revealed later in this scene that he is only marrying this woman not out of love but because her father is rich. After Pete gets off the phone, him and the boys from the elevator indulge in very typical toxically masculine behavior. But it's made very clear here that Pete is the leader of this group and clearly the smartest person amongst them. He perhaps isn't as smart as he thinks he is, as we'll find out in the episode, but still he's ambitious clearly and in control of these guys. Again, this scene does a great job at characterizing Pete as the possible antagonist because, like with Peggy and Draper, this impression on the audience is needed for the twist later in the episode to work. He is the oppressor, he is the womanizer. Peggy is the oppressed, and Draper juxtaposes Pete by standing up for the oppressed and not being a womanizer. That's how they're all characterized. Then we get more Peggy characterization as the character of Joan is introduced as her superior. Joan is a very interesting element thematically because in the narrative she represents the girl who thrives in this sexist environment. She may have originally been like Peggy, all wide-eyed and innocent, but has either been molded by or molded herself around her environment and knows how to get what she wants out of the office. She's dressed provocatively and is overly nice to everyone, as seen here with Peggy. But thematically, in terms of systematic oppression, she's now found herself reinforcing the system. She's not as bad as the example I'm about to draw here. She's like Samuel L. Jackson's character in Django, someone who thrives in this oppressive system so therefore doesn't seek to change it. And therefore, even though they are oppressed, continue to institutionally reinforce this oppression for their own personal betterment. Joan encourages Peggy here to become more like her and play into her sex appeal more to make the boys sing, as she puts it. Instead of forging her own path as an equal and rejecting this system that has a very specific role for women, Joan is telling Peggy to give up and embrace it and use it to her advantage, therefore indirectly reinforcing the system, showing just like Sam earlier that oppressed minorities can reinforce these systems as well. Joan is just an actor in a system. The sexism is even internalized in women. That's what makes it systemic. Seeing the system reinforced on everyone on top of Peggy makes her more sympathetic and further characterizes her as the representation of the oppression going on. Again, the audience must like innocent Peggy for the twist to work later on in the episode. Joan as a character also shows some cynical self-awareness here as she belittles the systematically more powerful men around her a little bit, explaining that in secretaries these big bad men really just want something between a mother and a waitress. This shows that even if a group has all the power in a scenario, they can still be cynically belittled from the sideline by the people who perhaps know them best. Also in this scene, there's some examples of Peggy indulging in some internalized oppression here, as she laughs when Joan explains that the technology used in the office is even easy enough for a woman to use. Peggy is not here as a feminist looking to lead a revolution in the workforce, at least not here initially. She's just a girl who we are following into this incredibly toxic and sexist environment. Therefore, jokes about women like this are funny to her. This is an important point. These characters are not all perfect and sometimes fall into these systematic potholes, like Draper does later in the episode when he says a few sexist things to Rachel. These characters are simply being used to highlight these issues, and perhaps they will try and address them later on, but the ball is really left in the viewer's court to now change these identified issues in the real world. These are not perfect revolutionaries, but the way they interact with this oppressive system that the contemporary audience views as immoral is the way they are related and made likable to us. That's why Peggy and Draper are positioned to be our protagonists, while Pete is is clearly being positioned as our antagonist, at least initially. They stand opposite of the oppression and he stands for it. There's then a scene with Draper and his boss that I don't think particularly is relevant to this video. It serves to introduce the boss as a character and to tell the audience that Draper used to be in the military, which I imagine will be important later on. But after that, there's the introduction of Sal from the creative department. Now, we've touched on the issues of black people and then the issues of women in this show, and now, if you haven't picked on the not so subtle hints throughout this scene, and especially in the scene later on in the strip club, we are using Sal here to touch on gay issues. This show has opted to explore marginalized communities in all areas, so this one fits, and it's nice to see that the show has the balls to go all the way with its theme. But the scene also plays into everything set up by the episode so far about systematic oppression. Sal also makes a sexist comment about strippers, which is almost justifiable since he's only trying to fit in and come across as straight, but again, Draper ignores the comment and doesn't indulge in the sexism here, he just runs past the remark. Just like the black man before, the gay man engages in casual sexism even though they likely relate to the plight of women. Then we get a scene with a female doctor from the company as she has come up with this death wish solution to their marketing problem. The scene not only introduces Freud as a concept as well as philosophy and psychology to the show, while also progressing the plot, but says something thematically as well, as the doctor is also a woman. I think the doctor in this scene is being used as an example of what Peggy could become in this sexist environment, just like Joan, even though they are polar opposites. Joan plays into the sexualization and objectification and gets what she wants by manipulating her oppressors, while the doctor seems to have grown cold and angry with the men that seem to always be above her and seems generally bitter about everything, though she is clearly very successful, potentially even more successful than Joan. These are two demonstrable paths that Peggy could take, and they are being outlined here in the first episode. I look forward to seeing which direction she goes in following this episode, and I think this is a great narrative device. Following that scene, we get our first interaction between Peggy and Draper as she wakes him up after he fell asleep in his office. Peggy stands up for herself a little bit here and points out that she doesn't really want to go and entertain Pete, who's waiting outside, when Draper asks her to. They have a cute moment of camaraderie here, coming together about how annoying Pete is. The fact that Peggy is very clearly not a big fan of Pete at this point will be important later on. Pete then enters and he repeatedly sexually harasses Peggy, reinforcing the idea in the audience that he is our antagonist. Eventually, Draper shuts him down and embarrasses him in front of Peggy, and this is the second moment in the episode where Draper has stood up against the oppressor for someone being oppressed. Initially, of course, with Sam, and now with Peggy. This endears him to Peggy and the audience and reinforces that he is our protagonist. We then transition into a scene where Pete and Draper are walking through the halls, and Draper points out that Pete is getting married soon and seems to be subtly chastising him for trying to hit on other women and not being loyal to his wife. Again, for a first-time viewer, this endears Draper to the audience. Cheating is generally seen as a bad thing by most people, so Draper siding with this means he's siding with the audience, and for the 50th time, this endears him to the audience, which needs to happen for the twist to work. We then transition into the meeting with Rachel, and here is where the glorious image of Draper that the show has been building starts to fall apart. Rachel has recently taken over her father's Jewish department store because of his terrible performance as leader the previous year. Obviously, this comes with a lot of struggle being a woman in 1960, which obviously plays into the grander themes of the episode. She wants the store to be targeted to wealthier customers instead of housewives, and when Draper disagrees, and his only leading idea is some tired coupons, the meeting goes awry. There are multiple instances of Draper showing his own personal biases here in this scene, and this is the first time we've seen him fall into these structural potholes. It's important that he does and demonstrates that he's not the perfect egalitarian like we went over before with Peggy. Initially, when the scene begins, there's an awkward moment where he mistakes the other man in the room for the client, only for it to be revealed to him that Rachel owns the department store. Rachel sarcastically plays into the embarrassment here when Draper says he was expecting her to be and then is cut off by Rachel, who says, "To be a man, so was my father, don't worry." This serves as an impeccable way to immediately characterize Rachel as exactly who she is. And the more blatant example of Draper being sexist is when, after Rachel makes fun of him for his coupon idea, and he storms out explaining that he's not going to take this from a woman. In between the beginning and the ending of the meeting, we cut to Peggy at the doctor's getting a prescription of birth control pills, which, as it is revealed in this scene, was Joan's idea. Joan is sleeping with the doctor and has asked a favor, again showing Peggy that playing into the oppression can do many things for you. Joan sleeps with this man and therefore can use him to get what she wants. He's a contact she can use. This undeniably will influence Peggy and is showing her that to get what she wants, sleeping her way to the top is a very plausible option. The Doctor also again plays very directly into the rampant sexism theme by bringing up women's sexual liberation. And obviously this portrays the Doctor very poorly, as he is clearly being judgmental here but is a total hypocrite. He clearly indulges in frequent out-of-wedlock sex, at least with Joan, but likely with others as well, but is still oddly judgmental when it comes to giving the pills to Peggy here, by constantly reiterating that she is to use them responsibly, and even makes it clear to her that easy women don't find husbands, implicating that Peggy needs to placate what men want and live her life accordingly, which is an obviously sexist idea, while also assuming that she wants or needs a husband. Again, this highlights the issues of systematic oppression here, as even someone who indulges in easy women, therefore being an easy man, is very against the idea of women's sexual liberation in principle. It's clearly a double standard. Again, showing that this issue is systematic and that the problems of oppression bleed through in nearly every area of society. Following the pill scene and the meeting, there's some Pete and Draper stuff that's more plot relevant than thematically relevant, so we'll skip to Joan introducing Peggy to the call ladies. Again, this is another example of women reinforcing the oppressive system, as one of the call ladies advises Peggy to show off her legs more because it would make Mr. Draper fonder of her. Joan also notes here that Peggy's predecessor left because Draper wasn't fond of her, which gets a suspect look out of Peggy. From the limited interaction she's had with Draper, it doesn't seem like he's the type to fire someone who doesn't sleep with him, but everyone is telling her otherwise, which leads her to the decision she makes later on in the episode to try and seduce him. Again, systematically, even the women feed into the oppression. Then we have a great scene where we actually see Draper be good at his job, of course convincing a group of entirely men of a new slogan to sell Lucky Strike cigarettes. It's a great scene, maybe the most well-acted scene in the episode, but thematically I don't think it's got anything to do with this video. Besides when Pete tries to use the argument Draper rejected earlier from the female doctor, trying to use the concept of a death wish as a slogan that the Lucky Strike people reject. This will play into things later between Draper and Peggy, and also demonstrates that Peter is willing to steal ideas out of Draper's trash. It also demonstrates that Draper was right about the death wish idea, and Pete actually doubles down on this afterwards, explaining that he still thinks that the doctor was right. There's then a scene with Draper and his boss celebrating the big victory with Lucky Strike, which leads into the Pete scene where he doubles down on the death wish idea that I just talked about. They then all leave after Draper again denies the offer to come to Pete's bachelor party, which leaves Peggy and Draper alone, where she thanks him for a great first day and tries to seduce him. He lets her down pretty harshly, explaining that he's her boss, not her boyfriend, and more importantly, he gets mad at her for allowing Pete to get access to his trash and get the research about the death wish strategy. This says a lot about Draper to characterize him for a first-time viewer. It demonstrates that he doesn't take advantage of Peggy here in any sexual way, demonstrating that he isn't actually like everyone else says, and isn't like the other men in the office. And maybe even more importantly, it demonstrates that he's loyal to his girlfriend from earlier in the episode. Also, this scene shows that he prioritizes business over sexual validation. The primary issue Draper addresses here in this scene is the liability Peggy poses if she continues to fall for Pete's tricks, allowing him to go through Draper's office unmonitored. This is the most important thing to him over Peggy's sexual advances. Another important part of this scene is when Peggy, after being rejected, is very concerned that Draper might think she's that type of girl, rather than a professional disgrace. This could have led to her losing her job, but she doesn't care about that, and really wants Draper to not think of her as a slut, showing again that the oppressed class even internalizes their oppression. She still thinks it's a bad thing to be sexually liberated because of this patriarchal structure she operates in, and that shows as this seems to be her biggest concern coming out of this interaction. Draper then lets her down easy as he clearly feels sympathy for her and says that they can get a fresh start tomorrow. All this factors into the previously established characterization of Peggy and Draper in the episode. Even though Peggy did try to play into this system and try to seduce Draper here, her general nervousness and her trepidation after being rejected plays back into the innocent girl character the series has portrayed up until this point. But just like Draper in the meeting with Rachel, this perfect image is starting to be pulled back on. And the scene plays into Draper's characterization as he does the right thing and doesn't take advantage of Peggy here, which again endears him to the audience. We then transition to Pete, Sal, and the other nameless office boys at Pete's bachelor party in a 1960s strip club. This has been teased throughout the episode, and besides the major hint that Sal is gay, this scene primarily illustrates Pete at his lowest. He just failed professionally in a big way, and here he fails in a personal endeavor as he is rejected by a girl who's also at the club. This is also where the audience's opinion of Pete hits rock bottom as he nearly forces himself on this girl after groping her. Again, this just feeds into the overall sexist theme of the episode. The nameless office boys here are incredibly rude to a waitress as they order her around like a dog. But the important takeaway from this scene is that Pete is an absolute mess. He's failed here to pick up a woman at what was supposed to be his celebration. He tried to steal something out from underneath of Draper professionally and both failed. So then he tried to force himself on this girl and got nothing, very much reinforcing the audience's dislike in him. To juxtapose the last scene, we then cut to Draper and Rachel at dinner, as Draper tries to patch things up from the earlier meeting. This scene is ripe with sexual tension. The original meeting was more adversarial, but this one is clearly playing into the potential relationship between these two characters, which is interesting since we've seen Draper multiple times throughout the episode deny any sexual advances or situations that could have led him to cheat on his girlfriend. So as a first-time viewer, the assumption being made here is that this will be a future plotline and eventually lead to relationship drama in the future. They even tease a potential future relationship directly in the dialogue when Rachel says, after Draper asks if he can ask a personal question, that he should try and get a few more drinks in her first. But then the scene becomes about characterizing Draper again as we see a far more cynical side of him come out. Eventually, the conversation devolves into a discussion about marriage. This is the second time in the episode marriage has been brought up, firstly with Draper proposing the idea to his girlfriend and now here. It's an interesting question from Draper, who we are assuming is also unmarried at this point, as it seems they are relating to each other about being unmarried. The narrative is drawing a parallel. Then Draper goes on his own analytical diatribe after Rachel explains that she's never been married before because she's never been in love. Draper laughs this idea off, explaining that love was invented by people like him to fool people into buying products, and that it doesn't actually exist, which initially floors Rachel but ultimately wins her over when she relates to his cynicism. She says she understands what it's like to look at things from the outside and that she sees the same struggle in Draper. I think we are going with the Tony Soprano pseudo-sociopath thing here, and this is the first scene where it comes through. Draper feels alienated from all his peers because of how his brain works, and Rachel feels alienated from all of her peers because they're all men. They can relate to each other because of this shared alienation. But this scene serves the sexist theme as well, just by the mere asking of Draper's question. What Draper is getting at here is basically that being a woman is easier in society since you get to stay home and put an apron on. He's implying, if not outrightly stating, that Rachel should give up her aspirations in business and check out because she's attractive enough to be a housewife, and that life is easier. This is the fundamental implication of the idiom, the grass is always greener on the other side. Draper is a man, and he knows the struggles of being a man in this society, so of course being a woman seems easier to him, but if he were a woman, he'd almost certainly think that it was easier being a man. After all, you don't know what you have until it's gone. Rachel thought exactly the same thing from the other perspective until she has a great line here where she shows more introspection than Draper does, when she says that she just realized that it must be hard to be a man as well. This seems so obvious to Draper, so when she has this realization, it shocks him and forces him to rethink what Rachel might think is obvious that he hasn't realized. Eventually, the scene ends after Rachel has been won over by Draper and agrees to give him and the firm another chance after their conversation. This is the best characterization Draper has had all episode, and because of it, I think this is the second best scene in the entire episode. Then the episode gets incredibly interesting with the last two scenes. Firstly, with Pete showing up creepily at Peggy's door looking for some sexual validation after his terribly unsuccessful day. This scene is awkward and tense, but that's the point. Peggy's housemate answers the door and immediately, not knowing who Pete is, closes the door and says that they aren't buying anything. But then these twists I've been building up all video start taking place, as each of our core three characters start breaking free from their narrative roles. Pete responds with the line, "For the first time today, I'm not selling anything." And the actor does a fantastic job at delivering this line because he somehow sounds entirely sympathetic. This isn't isn't the Pete we've been watching all episode. He seems vulnerable and genuine. The housemate gets Peggy and they have an awkward conversation where she asks him what he's doing here and he says he came to see her, clearly implying that he wants to sleep with her. Peggy maintains her innocent wide-eyed characterization here until she doesn't. And in a perfect turn of events, just like Pete, she breaks free of her narrative roles and is actually the one that initiates with him, taking his hand and leading him inside. Peggy is the one who takes advantage of Pete in his drunken and depressed state. I love this twist and the character changes here. Thinking about the motivations behind both these characters here is so interesting and revealing to who they actually are. Pete's motivations are largely obvious. He had a bad day and wants someone to sleep with and someone to value him. So he turns to the new girl, Peggy. Peggy, on the other hand, might be motivated by a variety of things. Maybe she's still down about being rejected by Draper. Maybe she thinks she's too ugly and not good enough for him, and now sees a way to seek sexual validation from Pete here to prove that she's worth something. Maybe she's decided to embrace the system like Joan has been telling her all episode. She saw an opportunity to get a foothold in on Pete here and took it. He might catch feelings for her after this that she can exploit later on. And even if he doesn't, she's still closer to him than ever. Also, the implication of the contraceptive pills plays a role here. There is relatively no risk in Peggy doing this because there shouldn't be any risk of her getting pregnant. If Joan hadn't gotten her an appointment, maybe she wouldn't have gone through with this. Plus, to add another dimension to all of this, she's now technically a homewrecker and will have to deal with the moral weight of that moving forward. But again, the perfection in this scene is in the fact that the characterization the show has done up until this point is undone. The stereotypes you thought these characters fit into are subverted in the first episode. Peggy has grown. She's no longer the innocent girl. She's showing some initiative, and Pete is now seeking validation from the person he was demeaning and oppressing earlier in the episode. Everything's flipped on its head here and it's brilliant. And I'm left here wondering if the show has the balls to give a character like Pete a long-term redemptive character arc. This is the last scene of both of these characters in the episode, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing how the show develops this relationship and these characters moving into episode 2, which I want to remind you I haven't seen yet. Then we transition into the final and best scene of the episode. We follow Draper on his way home as he takes the train into the suburbs, where he then gets in his car and drives to his massive home, and that's when the major plot twist in the episode is revealed. Don Draper is married. This is an astronomical development that recontextualizes everything that's happened in the episode, and does for Draper what the previous scene did for Peggy and Pete. He breaks free of his narrative roles here. Draper walks in the front door and into his bedroom, where his wife wakes up and greets him before he goes downstairs and mindlessly tucks his children into bed. His wife watches lovingly from the door, completely unaware of what's going on, and the episode ends. This is a masterful twist, throwing everything you know about Don Draper out the window. He wasn't at all acting loyal to his girlfriend in the episode when he didn't go to the bachelor party and when he didn't sleep with Peggy, because the artist girlfriend was actually the side girl the entire time. Now him and Rachel are definitely going to have a relationship, and this makes his comment to his girlfriend about maybe getting married, and more importantly his conversation with Rachel about not believing in love, incredibly more interesting and impactful. He's also now laughably hypocritical for chastising Pete for cheating on his wife, as it's revealed here that Draper is actually a total womanizer. We fell in love with this fake idea of Draper, and now being confronted with all of the context is truly fascinating. Because we wouldn't have fallen in love with him if we had known from the start that he was cheating on his wife from the beginning. Why didn't he sleep with Peggy then, is a question I keep asking myself. It wasn't out of loyalty, so he must not be attracted to her. She's clearly a pretty girl, but his type is clearly the cynical and sarcastic girls, as we've seen through his girlfriend and through Rachel. These are the developed girls with striking and sharp personalities, and innocent Peggy doesn't seem to cut it. The lengths the show had to go through to drip feed the audience the information for this twist to work was a masterful stroke of writing structure. Somehow the entire time we had no idea he had a family. He never mentioned it, no one around him mentioned it, and everything had a bullshit motivation the narrative set up to hide his true motivation. I love twists like this that recontextualize everything that came before it, and this is the show's shining selling point. Maybe you can't comprehend how great the twist was from my analysis here, so I would encourage everyone to watch the episode for yourself and join me on this journey as I finally continue watching this series, now that this script is done. That's the extent of my thoughts on the first 40 minutes of Mad Men. I loved it. I loved it so much that it made me quit anime. I'm sure I could probably write a video essay on each episode of this show, but it would kill me. And me not watching episode 2 to write this script has been death. If you like the video, consider influencing me to make more by becoming a patron. I'm also trying to grow the Twitch stream, where we talk about all sorts of media analysis. So if you want to argue with me, do it there. Support links in the description below. Thanks.